The national preoccupation with interpersonal violence and abuse of force, the manipulation and deception in the service of power, begs the church for comment, if not leadership. Day after day, week after week, we are witness to the spectacle of our brothers and sisters at each other's throats. And it takes a great deal to save oneself from joining the fight. I found myself wishing, God forbid, wishing for a guilty verdict in the trial of the policeman who killed Laquan McDonald. Not just for justice sake, but to have a violent impact. One of my sisters is a nurse. She's a director of nursing and hospice program in Chicago. She called me not too long ago to tell me that the police had told her and her neighbors to prepare for riots in anticipation of a not guilty verdict in the trial of that officer who shot Laquan. My sister is a good nurse with a soul of gold whose life's work is easing the passage from life to death. She is a bringer of comfort, a teller of jokes, a baker of cakes, a soother of pain. She likes dogs and ice cream and German music at Vespers. She sent her daughter to youth groups in high school for the perpetuation of the hope of Palestinian-Israeli peace. She is not looking for riots. She, like you and like me, is looking for reconciliation in this country. But on that day, we realized that despite the danger, we hoped that there would be riots if Laquan's killer was not convicted. God, forgive us. We hoped that against all our instincts, all our training, all our ethics, because in our desperation about the political corruption annihilating the life of Chicago, we thought that those riots would release that chokehold on that city. And it's a bitter hope. And it's a terrible thing to feel violence in one's own heart. It doesn't matter that it's violence born of righteous rage at the injustice and cruelty of a system pledged to protect its citizens. That violence is still a raging, destructive monster clawing at the walls of one's mind. And so it was in 13th century Italy, when Francis of Assisi was alive. Italy was then a collection of city-states caught between the Holy Roman Emperor on one side and the Pope on the other. The Pope and the Emperor between them kept Europe in the Middle Ages mostly at war. The prevalent idea, and you might recognize this idea, was that to keep peace, to save souls, one must go to war. War and the money that financed it and flowed from it was the business of the state and the church. Wealth and power were wound together with violence. Thus it was that Francis went to war on behalf of Assisi. In those battles, Francis experienced the pointless devastation that is war. And so Francis, who had longed to become a knight fighting for peace for the Pope, began to feel at odds with himself, began to feel that depression and illness that comes from serious moral conflict. And this is the same moral conflict, it seems to me, that Jeremiah voices to King Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, in the last days of the Egyptian occupation before the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. Woe to him who builds his house by unrighteousness, says Jeremiah. Jehoiakim is a sellout. First to Egypt, then to Babylon. His claim to kingship in Judah is corrupt. He buys his throne with the blood and sweat of his people in his own desperate pandering to Egypt and Babylon. Jehoiakim does not know God, says Jeremiah, because he does not attend to the cause of the poor and the needy, as his father did. For this reason it will not go well with him, Jeremiah says. And indeed, Jehoiakim is carted off to Babylon in chains when Jerusalem falls. In ancient Judah, as in Italy in the 13th century, as in Chicago and Washington this week, and perhaps sometimes in my own heart, violence is understood as the only way forward in the midst of great helplessness. When the voice of reason has long since been silenced, when the sanctity of human life is a phrase sometimes only heard in prayer books, when the division between the empowered and the disempowered seems uncrossable, violence takes its root. Francis became ill in the course of his military expeditions in quest of knighthood. His long illness gave him time to reconsider his life, and, as so often happens in that condition, he underwent a great illumination of the soul, during which he experienced mystical encounters with Christ. The experience of Christ as love. While Francis was losing all his convictions, all his foundations, all his approaches to life, gave him hope again, awakened Francis to the possibility of love as an alternative to violence. Francis is an example of one of the infants Jesus is talking about in Matthew's Gospel, the poor in spirit, the infants, as the Gospel calls them, have heard and understood that abundant life is only to be found in love. Jesus, love in human form, invites us to surrender the fight. We are tested. We are tested now in this nation, as the Jews were tested in Jerusalem, and as Francis was tested. We lose our way because all our attempts to make things right don't work, because all of our ideas about how to respond have to do with fighting. Francis suggests, as Jesus did before him, that if we can just be open to the willingness of God to share the burden of injustice and hatred and poverty and all the other things that make us sick to death, we may also experience transformation, resurrection, hope. So when the jury convicted Laquan McDonald's killer, I was relieved but not happy. I am not yet free of the impulse to fight back. I had not accepted that the violence in my own heart needed as much conviction, as much surrender, as that police officer did. I know that Jesus lives in that convicted man, just as he lived in Laquan, but I don't know how to reconcile what he did. But that's the blessing of Francis. If I think about Francis, I see that I don't have to understand it at all to offer love. In fact, there's no need to make that officer suffer. That won't help Laquan's family. Francis understood that reconciliation is much more powerful than retribution. And if you look at the work of the followers of Francis, one of whom is in our midst, you will see that today. Francis didn't set out to change the world, but he did. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. When we don't have to attach ourselves to anything but love, when we only have to be quiet enough to feel that love, we are in heaven. Heaven is, after all, the condition of being with God. And we in this church are all here to make heaven with God right now. And when the world tries its best to convince us that we're helpless to change it, we can remember Francis, who healed his world one person at a time. In the words of the man of Assisi, may God grant you peace.